Tony D and Little Joan with a screenwriter's tip. And let me read it from my friend here. This is LeMay, one of my regulars in the chat on Sundays. I heard mixing fantasy and mystery is difficult to do. What is your opinion about this? Okay, so we're talking about mixing fantasy and mystery together. I think LeMay is working on a manuscript. Smash like and subscribe. Thank you for smash liking and subscribing. Check out my books. The links are in the description. Comedy, horror in South Jersey. It's the Pineys. Books 1 through 16. Available at Amazon.com. Don't forget, Kindle Unlimited is free. So, mystery and fantasy. It is a bit of a difficult mix, but it can be done. Here's the challenge. The challenge is this. In a fantasy world, things can happen that defy physics because magic will defy physics. There's a lot of magic in fantasy. Things like elves and dragons, dwarves, and other things like that. They not only defy physics, but they have their own deals, right? So, for instance, elves live a very long time in some stories. And in some stories, they're way more physically capable than humans. Same thing with the dwarves. Dragons have their own, again, supernatural deal. But it changes from fantasy world to fantasy world. There are other fantasy worlds where the dragons aren't very powerful, where the elves don't live thousands of years, where the dwarves are more commonplace. It depends on the fantasy world. So that is why if you're doing a mystery set in a fantasy setting, it's very important to clearly define the parameters of your fantasy setting. So, for instance, if you have a fantasy setting which is more urban and modern, I can't think of the name of the story, but there's this one where magic exists and the devil is constantly trying to buy people's souls, and the devil has billboards all over the place, sell your soul and, get rich, that kind of thing. And it's about a detective agency that works in this fantasy type setting where magic exists along with cars and radios and internet and all that kind of stuff. So what you have to do is clearly define how magic works in that universe. Because if you don't, and then suddenly oh, he got away with murder because, it turns out there was this spell you didn't know about. Yeah, that doesn't work. You have to clearly define the physics of your universe in a fantasy setting in order for the mystery to work, because what happens in a mystery, right? So in a regular mystery that's grounded in reality, your murderer might use a very elaborate obfuscation in order to poison a target and frame somebody else for it. So, for instance, I don't know, you might have this murder that takes place because the murderer has a special teapot and he pours tea for everybody who drinks it and they're fine, but when he pours it for the victim, the poison comes out and kills him when he drinks it. And because of that, initially the person being targeted is the person not who poured the tea, but say the person who made the biscuits. And it turns out, yes, they made the biscuits, and a few of them were actually full of poison, but it turns out, the poison was administered in a different way, and it was all obfuscation. In a fantasy setting, where you could use magic to use that obfuscation, you would have to eliminate the magic as, a perpetrator. So, for instance, one of the easiest ways might be that, let's say you have a group of wizards that meet and one of them's murdered. Well, when they meet in this special castle, the castle doesn't allow them to use magic. That would be one way. right? And then you could say, all right, I've eliminated the possibility that someone used magic to kill him. So it grounds the mystery aspects more in reality, and so now you can focus on the actual physical clues that could not have been altered by magic. That would be one way. Another way would be to have a very specific universe where magic had a particular function, and that was clearly denoted in the manuscript. So, for instance, you might have a world in which, there are three kinds of wizards, let's say. One wizard, he's a mechanical wizard. His magic only works on machines. And then there's another wizard, well, he's a healing wizard, and his magic only works on healing you. Can't hurt people. And then the third kind of wizard is like a word wizard. His magic only impacts like the written word, let's say, or transcribing written text from your brain onto a piece of paper, let's say. And there are no other kind of wizards in this universe, so you would have to make the murder happen because of the particular kind of wizardry that happened, or eliminate the wizardry in total. Monsters are another factor. You're going to have to, in a fantasy setting, denote what kind of monsters exist and how they exist. So you might have a world in which you have tons of monsters, but it may be an advanced, more modern setting. Yes, there are dragons, but they're often pets. Yes, there are, sphinxes and other types of magical creatures, but they only show up in a circus or far out in the wilds where they can't hurt people. Something like that. You have to very clearly delineate the fantasy aspects so that the mystery aspects that people can wrap their brain around it, because otherwise, they're just going to throw up their hands and they're not going to be able to follow the mystery, if that is an aspect in the mystery. So if you just have a murder and somebody's trying to figure it out, and it turns out, the murderer is a wizard and he was able to kill somebody 50 miles away, you're going to have to account for how come he doesn't just kill all his enemies that way, and why is this the first time he's getting caught? Like all these things have to be fleshed out. So if you have a world in which people can teleport, that's a huge problem. That's a big issue. To give you an example, I did a fantasy comic called The Travelers. And the history of the Travelers was greatly impacted by magic, which I explain in one of the issues. What happened was, around the year 1000, it's set in an alternate Earth. So around the year 1000 or 1100, somewhere around there, there was a wizard in the European kingdoms by the name of Esposito Fong. He was one of my characters in D&D. Anyhow, Esposito invents the teleport spell. And it allows him to teleport vast distances. And he eventually teleports himself to the New World and discovers it, 300 years before Columbus. And at the same time, the goblins and other creatures that plague mankind in Europe, it's akin to Middle Earth. So there are orcs, goblins, that kind of thing. They are attacking the empires of Europe. And they are at the same time being ravaged by the Black Plague, which, as it turns out, the goblins and orcs are completely immune. They're completely immune to the Black Plague. The trolls, the ogres, just doesn't infect them. It only affects the humans, elves, and dwarves. So eventually it gets so bad, the European kingdoms start teleporting their people to the New World 300 years earlier. And thus, the European kingdoms eventually collapse in Europe, and the survivors move to the New World, essentially where the United States would have been. And then the the comic takes place, I think, over a century later, where the new kingdoms have been reestablished under different names, which are all my fake kingdoms in the comic. And yeah, and it's sort of like a free for all. It's sort of an alternate Earth where magic greatly impacted the history. The teleport spell greatly impacted the history of the world. And you need to do something like that. You need to not put such heavy-handed magic into your fantasy world. You have to understand that it would impact things. And, if you're doing a mystery in which some guy's murdered and his body disappears and the teleport spell exists, you got a real problem on your hands, because if you kill somebody and teleport their body into the middle of the ocean, how's anybody going to find it? So you can't make things too powerful or too crazy. You have to have the ability to show to the audience, and you want to show rather than tell. You need to show the audience how the mystery can unfold. They have to understand the world at which the fantasy world exists in enough so they can figure out the mystery too, or at least follow along. So, for instance, if you had a murder mystery that took place just amongst the elves in your world, you'd have to go very deep into the elvish world and how it works. Who lives where, how do they live, how much magic's involved, how can they be killed. All that stuff needs to be kind of known before you even get into the mystery. The easiest thing to do is not to put too many fantasy elements in, because the more you put in, the more you have to account for. So I, of course, use Dungeons and Dragons sort of as a baseline for a lot of things, because there's already a system in place for you to account for a lot of that stuff. So that would be one way to do it. Sort of use Dungeons and Dragons, not really spelling it out in the series because there's a couple of copyright issues, but to kind of use it as a guide in the back of your head, because there is a balance in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I don't know about today. I don't play any 4th or 5th edition now. No thanks. 3rd edition, I think, was peak D&D. But you sort of use that behind the scenes in your own brain to kind of go, okay, this is the amount of magic and fantasy stuff I want, and maybe you turn it down or turn it up from that kind of baseline. And then just follow the parameters of a mystery, and there you go. And there you go. So, that's all you do. And then follow, I would also follow the 3-act structure. I find that very useful. First act, second act, third act. First act, you introduce the characters, you introduce the world. So you're probably going to have a big first act with a story like this. Second act would be the beginning of the mystery, so they find the body, let's say. And then throughout the second act, your protagonist is trying to figure out the mystery, trying to figure out who did it, gathering clues, getting attacked by various forces that don't want the mystery solved, or the murderer themselves. And then the climax of the whole thing is the murderer is uncovered, and maybe there's like a battle at the end between the murderer and the protagonist, and in the end, hopefully your protagonist wins, and on to the next thing. So yeah, that's how I would merge fantasy and mystery. And that's it for me, Tony D, and Little Joan, somewhere in behind me on the floor and on her little bed. I don't like to disturb her. She's very comfortable. Had a lot of turkey for Thanksgiving. Tomorrow is Black Friday. I will be at the Triple Oaks Nursery Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 11 to 4 in Franklinville, New Jersey. And I will have copies of the Pineys. Hope to see you there. We'll see you tomorrow.